And we are pleased to have with us today Maude Champagne, who is one of our psychotherapists that have certainly worked with some of our youth within the Rural FASD Support Network. She's also a doctoral student with out of Queen's University, working with Dr. James Reynolds. And in fact, she was sharing with me that apparently he's got her extremely busy now doing a whole bunch of different things at this point. But one of the projects that she's recently finished is a research study on the effectiveness of Dyadic developmental psychotherapy for children with FASD and trauma. So, Maude, take it away.
Thank you. So this research that I'm presenting today was part of my master thesis. I studied social work as a master student. And so while I was doing that, I wanted to study some aspects of adoption. And then I had started doing psychotherapy with children with FASD using DDP. And I started being very curious about the effectiveness of it for kids with FASD. As Shelley mentioned, some of these kids don't respond well to traditional therapy, and yet we were using DDP for some of them. I knew it was adapted for them, but still had quite a few questions, and we felt at OCAD that we should maybe ask parents how they felt about it, how they enjoyed it. Maybe they had recommendations for us. And it was really about their perspective. So I had quite a few of my questions answered, and some of them are still not answered. So that's basically what I'm presenting today. Just a second. Okay. So I have to say, I do have somewhat of a conflict of interest because I do work at OCAT and I'm a psychotherapist. So it was approved by the ethics of my university, but I was not allowed to interview any of my past or current or future clients. Also, we had shared the poster at large in Ontario to other DDP therapists, but we only had clients from OCAT in the end. From what I asked to therapists that didn't have their clients participating, many of them felt like sometimes the child's not officially diagnosed, so they felt maybe it wasn't a good fit, or they felt like there was enough improvement. They were not sure it was the right fit. So anyway, we ended up having 5 families. One couple participated, so it's 6 participants to my study, and it was an exploration of really what they experienced during DDP when they had a child with FASD and with trauma. And I also want to acknowledge that Michelle and Tanya were really supportive of it. I was not allowed to share anything because it was their clients. So you'll see throughout the presentation, I share some of the data, but I always use fake names for the therapist and also for the clients, so you're not able to see, who I'm talking about. I have only one slide on FASD because I'm assuming that if you're watching this and if you're part of this group, you already know about FASD, and I only have 30 minutes. So one thing that I wanted to mention is when I did the literature review, they're still using secondary disabilities. So I know we're trying to stay away from that term, but it's still what they're using in the literature. And one thing I wanted to mention that felt important is that quite some times ago, when I started in FASD in 2006, we thought mental health issues were a result of a poor fit between the environment and what the child had. So that's what we call a secondary disabilities, such as, let's say adoption breakdown, school dropout, are not a direct result of the prenatal exposure. They're actually a bad fit between how we're supporting that individual and the disability. So we thought, okay, so mental health issues like depression and anxiety are the result of that. And then now with recent research, we're seeing, oh, actually these kids are, and individuals, not just children with FASD, are really susceptible to mental health issues. So we see it in animal studies, and we see it on even a research Jurikovic that I have here. He did a study on 18 infants that were prenatally exposed to alcohol in moderate to large amount. And these babies were quite susceptible for stress response. So what we know now is that even if you place a baby who's prenatally exposed to alcohol in the best environment, there's a lot of chances that this baby will end up having mental health issues in the future. So it's sad, but at the same time, it's sort of a relief for the parents to say, look, it's not that you're not providing the best environment, it's just your child is inclined to it. So, and at the end, if you have questions about it, we can talk about it. But I felt like it was important to talk about it. So what's the link between FASD and developmental trauma? If you're an adoptive parent, you have a child with FASD, I think the link is clear for you, but for professional, it doesn't seem to be that clear. I get this question all the time. So now we have a national database. Everyone who goes to an assessment for FASD at a clinic in Canada, they will enter the information in the database. So what we know is 50% of those individuals going for an assessment don't live with their biological parents. They live with adoptive parents, foster parents, or a relative. 40% of them are diagnosed with trauma. 15% are diagnosed with attachment difficulties. And from other studies, we know that they have been through a lot of adversities. In just a clinic, this one was in the States, 87% of kids with FASD have been through neglect, 50% physical abuse. So there's a link between both, and very few research look at this link, but more and more I think we're seeing researcher starting to question, okay, is it trauma, is it FASD, is it both? And if someone has FASD and they have a trauma history in many cases, what do we do? I mean, we're starting to look at intervention, like how can we help them for school, how we can help them for adaptive functioning skills, which is their ability to follow a routine. But are we really looking at how do we deal with their trauma? So that's why I wanted to do this research. So this one is not translated yet. I did my master's in French, and it's very small, but I just basically wanted to say that the symptoms of trauma, developmental trauma, are extremely similar to the symptoms of FASD. So for clinicians, it's hard to, especially when you don't have a history, to know which one we're talking about, which one we need to address first, and to determine the right profile for the child. So one thing that was quite different was dissociation. It's not in the literature that someone with FASD will dissociate if they don't have trauma. But everything else is very similar. We're talking about identity issues, mentalization, health issues, their understanding of the world, difficulty with empathy, dysfunctional behaviors, cognitive problems, learning difficulties, affect regulation, right? When I say that, I'm sure you're like, yeah, that's trauma, but that's also FASD. So it's hard to tell sometimes. So I started looking at the literature and think, has anything been done to deal with the trauma of people with FASD? And I could only find one study. And if you've seen the work of Christy Petrenko, she talks about it. She has a whole range of intervention that were developed, and she says there's only one for trauma. And so if you're familiar with Bruce Perry, it's from him and Zarnagar, a colleague. They took quite a few kids with FASD, but they ended up with only 10. They were preschoolers, all of them adopted, and they use CPP, which is a form of play therapy. It has a lot of similarities with DDP, and they used it for 6 months. And what they've seen is there was a lot of improvement in adaptive skills, cognitive skills, motor skills, and communication. So what this research tells us is, yes, we say FASD is a permanent disability, but we can see improvements in these children when we take them early and with the right intervention. One thing that they've seen in this research is the few kids that were not in a stable and nurturing home did not have the same results as the other children. So it's also an answer for us. And it's also, in terms of policy, those were preschoolers. So we're talking about having a permanency plan for children at an early age, having a developmental plan for these children at an early age is to me, it's critical. So that's the part of research that has been done for trauma and FASD, so only one. And when it comes to DDP research, there was nothing on FASD specifically, but I found one that was for adoptive parents. So she's done something very similar where she interviewed 12 parents, and her results are very, very similar. So what she's found is why the parents like the approach is that DDP takes into account that these kids have a different type of brain. So, the neurocognitively, it's different, and the approach takes that into account. That's why it seems to be working. Also, they haven't seen that much change in the child, but the parents certainly have more empathy and understanding of why the child behaves the way they do. And some of them saw that there's better conflict resolution. They're more inclined to trust the parent and accept comfort, something that's very difficult for traumatized children, and also a better affect regulation. But these kids, we don't know if they had FASD or not. So what she used and what I used, it's called IPA. So you're looking at all your interview, you transcribe, you look at the patterns, what's common, but also what are the differences between each cases, okay? And yes, you have your questions, but I didn't have an hypothesis where, okay, this is what I think I'm going to see, right? I was just taking it all in and being curious about what we were learning. Like I said at the beginning, it was hard to have enough participants. According to IPA, 5 is enough. I felt like I could have had more, but not enough participants, but we still got really good data that I'm going to share today. So for privacy concerns, usually we say we give a portrait of our participants, but I don't, because it's such a small community in Eastern Ontario, FASD wise. So all I'm going to say is they were all adoptive parents, except one was a kinship placement. They all had more than one child in total. Many of them had more than one child with FASD. All the kids were between 10 and 19, all heterosexual couples. And as you can see on my slide, they've been through all sorts of abuse. So just a sec, I'll drink a little bit. DDP is a form of therapy that was created for children who were adopted or in foster care. It was not created for kids with FASD, but we've been using it for them when they have attachment difficulties. So my questions were like, does it work? Do we need to adapt it? Can we see improvement? Those were my questions when I did this research. So, but what DDP is wanting to do is to improve emotional regulation, which is an issue for kids with FASD, and to facilitate the relationship between the child and the parent. So one more thing that I'm going to say is, when we do a qualitative study, we just take a snapshot of one time in the family journey. So if we took another snapshot now, you know, especially with COVID, these families may have changed quite a bit. So we're looking at a particular time in their journey when they did DDP. So all the families that I spoke to, when they started DDP, 3 of them were in crisis where, you know, even family members had their mental health compromised. These were not individuals that had previous mental health issues. Many of them were experiencing violence from the child towards themselves or sometimes their other children. They were inappropriate sexual behaviors, harming, you know, behaviors, cutting, running away. Some had tantrums daily. And some use the word war. It's like a war zone. Like the whole atmosphere was, you know, verbally and physically violent at times. 2 of the families were into a new adoption, and they started therapy before they had the child. So these families seem to have not a situation that was as severe, and it seemed to have been quite a buffer for difficulties because they were much more prepared. So I did not ask specifically about other therapies that people have tried before in parenting classes, but everyone, when I asked what led you to use, you know, to go for therapy and use DDP, all of them said, well, we've been through, you know, and I won't name them, but other therapies, other therapists, other services, but they were not trauma informed, and especially FASD informed. And it seemed to have been even traumatic for many families, like, you know, if you're being told that it's your fault, if your parenting is blamed, it's really hard for parents. It was certainly not helpful. And to me, it speaks to the need for all therapists, CS workers to be aware of FASD and developmental trauma, and to know what is recommended and what's not. We're talking CBT, you know, many people tried it before DDP, and sometimes it's even harmful. So I want to spend too much time on it. Oh my goodness, I have 10 minutes left. Okay. So now we're heading towards the results. So some of the benefits that the parents saw in the children, especially 2 families that started DDP before they had the child, there was way more changes in tantrums. So much less tantrums, not to say, you know, not at all now. So again, that's a key for us to think, okay, if people think of adopting, maybe they shall go, you know, see a therapist or, you know, a worker that is FASD informed before they adopt. Also, I'm just going to move this because I'm not seeing my slide properly. So yes, so a lot of these kids have a hard time asking for help, probably because of their trauma. And so that's something that has changed in many of these kids. So they're able to ask for help, less, you know, turning towards shame and like wanting to hide that they have issues. They were more accepting of their own issues. And some of them, especially the ones that were abused, were really embarrassed about the abuse and about their behavior. So because they had an understanding of why they're acting like this, because of their trauma, because they have a different brain, because of their amygdala, which you call the AMI, they're more able to ask for help. One thing that I really liked, and again, they're saying things like, she's really good at explaining how her brain works. And that's what Anne gave her. So Anne's the fake name, obviously. You know, all of them said she knows how her AMI works, which is, you know, part of the brain. So she's able to ask people at church or at school, this is what I need a movement break right now. So it doesn't solve the issue per se, but it's not aggravated by the fact that they don't know how to ask for their needs. Again, the shame reduction. So because if a child is traumatized by, let's say, they're abused, and they feel responsible for their abuse, when they enter a phase where they understand it's not their fault, it's not as traumatic. And that's part of the trauma-based therapy with DDP. So we can see that it has worked for many. And again, these were the benefits for the kids, but there are some benefits for the parents. So one thing that I was surprised with is most parents said, I felt really judged before in my parenting. And yeah, they all said, we had to change our parenting to adapt for FASD and trauma. But it seems like that change did not come with the shame and feeling judged, which is good, which is usually what therapists want. But all of them were talking about, we had some understanding of trauma, but not so much on FASD. And as we're learning, and sometimes the learning happened with the therapist, we really changed the way we were interacting with our child. And sometimes the child was not changing as much, but the parents had a better understanding, better acceptance, and they were quite hopeful. Like all of them, to me, had a very good understanding of their children's needs, of FASD, and they were really hopeful for the future, but not unrealistically, which was really good. All of them talked about liking the experience with the therapist, where the therapist could normalize the experience. And when I say normalizing the experience, when we're talking about FASD, you know, for another therapist who doesn't understand FASD, I don't think they may see it as normal, but for us, when we know FASD, it's normal. With FASD, it's a normal experience. So that was helpful to them. Just having that empathic listening seemed to have been really helpful. So neuroplasticity is the ability to change the brain. And parents were talking about it. So when I started in 2016, it's like, you know, we're doomed. There's no ability to change. It's a permanent disorder. But I think now parents see, okay, there's a place for change. There's a place for improvement. People are way more hopeful. They have realistic expectations of their children. I mean, most of them will need support for a lifetime, but doesn't mean they cannot have, you know, a good life. And I think that's what those parents are seeing. Sorry, I'm trying to do it so quickly. I have so many things I could say. That's just a summary of some of the benefits that we've seen. So some of the limitations of DDP seen by the parents, and that's a limit of my study. I think if we had you know, asked families where they tried DDP and it hasn't worked at all, I will have had a lot more information on it. A few people said, well, maybe memory is an issue, you know, language for some. The sensory processing disorder was an issue. So, you know, if there's too many distractions in the room, their understanding of abstract concept was a limit to the DDP. So my question was to ask, how was it adapted? And then I realized parents don't know how therapists adapt DDP because they're not trained in DDP. So that was kind of silly of me, but that I think it's something that therapists have to study. And maybe we need a meeting at some point and say, how are we adapting DDP? I know personally I adapt DDP a lot. And one parent mentioned it. I know that, the therapist, the fake name is Lori, she does SMART, she does all sorts of other things with my child. It's not pure DDP. And that's true. A pure DDP probably would not work. It needs to be adapted. But how? That's a question. So the fit, what I saw from what the parents have been saying is, because DDP is dyadic, the fact that the parent is often in the room and works with the parent as well really builds trust. Many families had children with two different therapists, and there was a collaboration happening, and that seemed to be very helpful. And so it's private services, which is an issue, but at the same time, if you go to public services, they'll say you have 6 months. For private services, it's a long-term support, and all families are like, I'll need long-term support, right? It's not like, okay, we do this trauma work and then my child's fine. No, it's long-term, because FASD is a permanent condition. So this part of the DDP that we're providing was helpful, and the dyadic aspect was huge. And I think that's one of our answers. We need a parent in the room. We need the parent to know how to communicate with someone with FASD, and vice versa. Sometimes it's the parent who says to the therapist, I don't think he understands you. It allows for generalization. If the parent sees what's being done in the therapy room, they can do the same thing at home and even at school. Yeah, so and I have it later. I think dyadic is one of the key things for FASD. And I don't have tons of time to keep talking about it. Again, so I think the dyadic aspect is important because we need to support the parent. In one research, it says that raising a child with FASD is one of the most difficult disability to deal with because there's so limited support, and it's invisible. So they don't get the same understanding from the community and the same support and acceptance, when they're looking at their children and their behavior. So I think supporting the parent is as important as supporting the child. So to summarize it, from what the parents have been saying, the major change was in their relationship with their child and not so much in the child himself. And we know that DDP, what they want is to have the attachment relationship being a source of healing for the traumatized child. And so I think in some ways it has worked because these families have a good relationship with their child. And that's what has improved through the therapy. And again, like I say that DDP hasn't worked for everyone. And when Shelley was mentioning equine therapy, music therapy, we need these things too. It's not only this type of therapy that will help them. So some of my recommendations, and my recommendations will be sent to CAS. I will build a lay summary for other therapists and for other service providers. But if you're thinking, okay, I think this person needs it, I will gladly share it, and I will have a longer presentation at the FASD Symposium in January. So what I think and what I advocate for is early intervention. We need it for 0 to 6 if we want to help these kids. And even if they're not placed in a foster or adoptive families, we need to start early, and that's CAS. CES needs to continue being transparent when they place children. It has gotten better from what I'm seeing in my research. You know, transparency in terms of the child's history, so parents know what they're signing up for. Diagnostic capacity is terrible in Ontario. We need to improve it. And also clinicians need to understand trauma and FASD so they don't do more damage for these families. And I think therapists and the whole professional community need to meet with parents and sit down and say what works and what doesn't work, so we can continue develop models of care to deal with their trauma in the best way possible. And that's my last slide. That's from Petrenko, and it's a model that I really like. Trauma therapy is just one aspect of the whole person. We really need a holistic approach, I think, to support with people with FASD and their families.